Carlos Nelson with Cascade Media Group. And tonight we really have a special guest. I wanted to have her on our Urban Professional series, but she's representing tonight her dad, which I felt that I had a decent relationship with Dr. Samuel Rodgers, and there's a book out, More Than a Doctor, and Miss Rosalyn Moore Rodgers.
Rosalyn Rodgers
The more
Moore.
at the end. Hey, Rosalyn, it's a plum pleasing pleasure having you on the show tonight. And I'd like for you to give our audience not just about the book, about you coming up, your dad and your siblings, and and then go into how the book was created.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation to appear on this program. It's my pleasure, and I'm so glad to be here, Carlos. As Carlos introduced me, I am Rosalyn Rodgers Moore, and I'm the author of a book entitled More Than a Doctor, The Extraordinary Life of Samuel Ulysses Rodgers. The book is about the medical achievements of my father, who was considered to be a visionary doctor who transformed healthcare delivery in Kansas City, Missouri. And more importantly, the book is about the family legacy of values and love that made it all possible against all odds. So this is a story about overcoming adversity and perseverance and being prepared. My father was a first in many things. He is most well known in Kansas City for being an OBGYN and for being the founder and executive director of the first federally qualified health center in the state of Missouri that carries his name, the Samuel U. Rodgers Health Center. And it's still serving today, serving the poor and making healthcare accessible in the inner city. My father's belief was that healthcare is a human right, meant to be enjoyed and accessible to everyone. And he carried that thread through his life. That was his motivation. This book explores the intersection between personal values and who you become as a person, and consequently your limitations or your opportunities as a leader. I wrote this book because I wanted people to know the fullness of my father's life, his full story. When he appeared in Kansas City, that was really chapter 2 of his life. And he accomplished many firsts. He was the one of 5 board-certified OBGYNs in the United States. He became the first African-American OBGYN certified in the state of Missouri. He came to Kansas City in the 1940s, but again, that was chapter 2 of his life. He established, years later, the Samuel U. Rodgers Health Center. So my quest in this book is not to just know what he accomplished. Many people knew that part of his life. What they didn't really know, who he was at the heart, who the heart of this visionary was, because the person he became throughout his life is what I feel really enabled him to do and accomplish the things that he did. So in telling you who he was, I couldn't start with just his beginnings. So this book goes back to the 1800s. It goes back 2 or 3 generations in our family. And I felt that that was essential so that you could understand the foundation and the family values that made him the person that he was, the experiences and the people and the places that got him to Kansas City, which was really chapter 2 of his life. He was born in a very small town called Anniston, Alabama, which is about an hour west of Atlanta, Georgia. He was the son of a country doctor who provided health care to the poor, whether they could afford it or not. So my father grew up as a child observing these things. People would show up in the middle of the night in pain and distress, and there was always help for them through my grandfather. My grandfather was, in addition to being a physician, he was also a pharmacist and owned his own store there in Anniston. So Anniston was a small town, and it was called the model city of the South. However, in the 1800s, the definition of model is not necessarily true for everyone. So there was two different worlds that you are not surprised by. And my father and his family lived on the other side of the proverbial tracks, so to speak. My father's family valued education, and there were many what I call migrational moments in my father's life based on this desire to gain an education. So I go back to the 1800s and I first start talking about his great grandfather, who is a minister, an activist minister in the AME church, one of the first churches where ministers actually learned how to read. And I understood from those beginnings that that was the beginning of the activist thread that ran through my family. So fast forward, my father left home along with his siblings at the age of 11 or 12. They left Anniston and they went not far away, but they went to a small town in Alabama called Talladega. So he finished his entire education up until he went off to medical school in Talladega, Alabama, because in those times, after you finished school at the age of 10 or 11 in the South, there was no way to further your education as an African American child. So if you wanted to pursue any education beyond the age of 10 or 11, you had to leave your hometown. So my grandparents had a plan for their children. There were 3 siblings, and they all went, along with their mother, an hour and a half down the road to Talladega College, where my father and his siblings remained until he was old enough to go to medical school. So that was virtually his entire childhood spent away getting an education. He eventually matriculated to Howard Medical School. He finished his medical studies, and the grand plan was for him to return to his small hometown of Anniston, Alabama, which he did. He and his father had dreamed for years that the two of them would practice medicine together. However, upon his return to what was then the Jim Crow South, there was no possibility that he would be hired at any of these segregated hospitals in Anniston. And it, at no surprise, was a huge disappointment for my father and his father. And my grandfather essentially told him, "Go. There's nothing here for you." And my father left and made his way to Kansas City. And Kansas City has, apart from being renowned for jazz and great barbecue, Kansas City has a unbelievable history when it comes to medicine. And my father went to Kansas City, first of all, in search of and his desire to become a surgeon. And in those days, when you finished medical school, you could only become a general practitioner. There was no option for any African Americans to specialize in pediatrics, cardiology, gynecology, any of that, because there was no one who was willing to train them. So my father migrated, the second major migration in his life, to Kansas City, which became chapter 2 of his life. And he began his internship at the infamous General Hospital, number 1 and number 2. Number 2 specifically because that was the segregated hospital where they treated Black patients. He was there for only a year in internship, and then he went to World War II, where he was stationed in Italy as a medic, where he would deliver blood plasma that had been separated for use and purposes of white officers versus Black officers. After he did a stint in the Army, he returned to Kansas City and finished his residency. And in the midst of all of that, he and several of his colleagues organized a boycott against the city hospitals because of their care or lack of care for the African American community. So there was a whole generation of doctors, of course, that preceded this effort. And my father and his colleagues stood on their shoulders and just took it a step further. The result of all of that ultimately was the desegregation of the hospital system in Kansas City. And oh, by the way, something else magical happened. And that's another thing that I talk about so much in the book. There was preparation, there was commitment, there were medical degrees, there were all of those things. But in the midst of all of that, there was the element of what I call serendipity, the miracle-making moments that nobody can plan. And you have to remember that this group of Black physicians had no other role models before them that were able to gain these specialties. So Kansas City holds a big place, not just in the city of Kansas City and the county and the state, but nationally in terms of medical history. And all of this group of Black physicians was able eventually to all be trained in specialties. And this happened at a hospital called Queen of the World Hospital, which became one of the first integrated hospitals in the United States, where Black physicians could practice under the same roof with white physicians, and Black and white patients could be seen in the same location. So many of you might remember Queen of the World Hospital. It was established by order of the Maryknoll nuns, who at that time did work all over the world, mainly in Africa. So they came to Kansas City, and it was quite the same mission when you think about it. And as a result of that, a handful of Black physicians gained their specialties, and that group of physicians, along with my father, formed one of the first private practices in the United States of America. The name of the practice was the Doctor's Clinic, and maybe many of you all were treated there as children. So that's a small bit about what he accomplished after he arrived in Kansas City. When he was 50, he determined, after much success in the private practice, the Doctor's Clinic, he decided that he wanted to do something at a much higher level that would affect more people. So at the ripe old age of 50, he decided that he would go back to school. And he entered the program at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to get his master's of public health, which was unheard of in those days. So needless to say, he risked and gave up quite a bit. He left his private practice, he left his family, and he went to Michigan and finished in a 2-year program there. In the mid 1960s, he returned to Kansas City. And that was around the time of, there was a lot of emphasis through President Lyndon Johnson on the war on poverty. And at that point, the federal government was willing to fund and establish health centers across the country. And Kansas City was one of the few. And my father was there in perfect timing with perfect preparation and with perfect grace. And another miracle occurred. He became the executive and first director of the Samuel U. Rodgers Health Center.
Yeah. Boy, I guess, well, no guess. I know the second part because I had no idea all of that about your dad, because when I used to go over there, and I guess right into his older age, Dr. Ken Spalding, he was from New York, and this was like in the late 70s or 80s when your dad had the clinic on Mongol. All right.
Right.
So Ken used to always come to my candy store that was on Prospect next to Southside Cleaners and Boxley's Garage, play chess with me. And him and Alexis was at the hospital. But then Ken was invited to join your dad's practice there. And what you were saying about surgery, I'll never forget Carl Peterson. I was like, how Ken get over here? He said, because Carl Peterson was one of my neighbors. I talked to you about that off camera. He said Ken had the most brilliant hands, surgical hands that he had seen. And they, that practice with Hayes, your dad, Peterson, I was in construction at that point.
Yes.
And they let me renovate the building. And that was so helpful for my income at that time. And then your dad even went further, and I think that's when I met you. I was coming over to the house to do the basement or do something.
Some ceiling work.
Right. Oh, all right. You remember. But
I remember.
I would have never dreamed in my wildest dreams that all this historical first, all of the accolades that had been heaved upon him, for lack of better words, as I said to you off camera, your dad, and I thought I knew him a little bit, he was the mildest, the meekest, the person that I met. Most people have at least a little bit of ego, but So what I'd like to ask you, what was it like growing up in the house with him? As a dad, daughter, and you got some other siblings.
I had an older brother and a younger sister who actually worked with my dad at the health center, and she's a practicing physician today and owns 2 practices of her own. So we grew up in a very, a normal household. I marvel at my father's ability to compartmentalize his life. And as I read and wrote, I read many stories about him. His life was, at least from a professional standpoint, well documented and well chronicled in all the major newspapers, the Kansas City Star, of course, the Call paper, numerous magazines throughout his life. So that is what most people know. What they didn't know about him was who he was on a personal level. And I have to say, in his case, the way you describe him is indeed who he was. He was consistent in terms of his personality, very low keyed, even temperament. And his father was very much like that. So there's a thread that runs through our
That
family.
was, see, you beat me to the punch. I don't like you no more. I wanted to ask you, did you know your grandfather?
Oh, absolutely.
Because that
Absolutely.
history, boy, that thread, bam.
It goes through. And that's what my quest was to find out. I knew what happened. Most people know what happened, if you follow his career. But I was really curious to know how it all happened. How it's not just about education and achievements. It's so much about the person that you become. And that is so much a result of the experiences that you've had and the people and the places that you've experienced in your upbringing. So my father is an interesting combination. And I named the book More Than a Doctor because everyone, of course, knew him to be a doctor, but in fact, he was much more than that. He was a teacher, he was a trailblazer, he was a community activist. And so that thread of activism, as I've researched and wrote this book, I realized came from my great grandfather's generation. So the first two generations of our family were born into slavery. The second generation, my great grandfather, Spencer Alexander, born into slavery, but became a minister in an activist AME church that had members and founders like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. And they uplifted women and believed that women had the ability to do anything that men could do. And so that's very much a theme throughout our family. My grandmother, my father's mother, was considered to be the business head of their family. And she was a member of many organizations and societies, and she held her own. She held her own. And
Big
so,
mama.
yes, yes, indeed. And she was the one that went away to Talladega with the three siblings to make sure that they all got their education and were able to move on beyond that. And in those days, there was no such thing as a middle school. So you finished high school sometimes at 16. My father finished at 15 or 16. He could have gone, the next step was medical school, but his mother held him back, not for academic reasons. She wanted to give him an opportunity for his emotions and for him to mature and not put him in an environment like that. So my father was very much a product of the way he was raised. And he was raised in an activist family who believed in education and believed in helping people. And he, mhm.
They also call me the cutoff king.
All right.
With I want to tie that to what's going on right now, to a degree. That do you really feel that our community as a whole uh, really values and really understand the sacrifices that people like your father made to put them in position to have these positions that they have, superintendents, mayors, and what have you. And one of the key things in what you talked about that stands out with me is you said, my dad really had to make this sacrifice to go back to school for 2 years. That was really risky. And
Yes.
this is Mr. Nelson. I don't see that commitment from our overall community to understand. And it might be because they only see the history books and they haven't lived long enough to really see the reality of the moves that they are making the domino effect, because our community, uh, as I said, when I met your dad in the late, I think, 70s or 80s,
That's right.
that there here in Kansas City, there were no Black doctors with practices where the population could go and get help, because my family, they were like, I was like, well, what doctors? Everybody used that office that your dad and them was in, and these young people, they don't really understand what all that's about. They see it in the history books, and I am so glad that you appeared tonight on our program, because you just didn't enlighten, you illuminated me, and anyone that looked at what you talked about, that really understands the healthcare field. And Jim Nunley, I want to mention his name, because Mr.
Yes.
Nunley is the one, when you came into town to talk about the book at the center, he texted me then, and I was like, Rosalyn, I know them. And then, and then
Yes.
I watched what he had done. I was like, but I don't know whether you went into detail the way you did tonight.
Well, if I can share some of that event with you,
Please.
that did occur January 30th. So that represented my second book launch of More Than a Doctor. I had a book launch in October for the supporters here in Atlanta. But the event at the health center, I could not have a more perfect venue, because Kansas City is where it all happened. And I named the event The Homecoming. And it was simply to be a conversation. And I wanted to bring people together that had known my father and worked with my father, to let them tell their own stories. And I interviewed about 9 people for this book, all of whom worked with my father. And that was the most joyous part of the writing journey. So when I had the book launch at the health center several weeks ago, I asked several people to participate in a panel, and they had all, for the most part, been interviewed and are part of this book. But there are so many stories. I ran out of room. As a new author, they limit your word count, and I have enough information for probably 2 or 3 or 4 books. And the stories just keep coming. You won't believe, at the event in Kansas City, the panelists that I had told stories that, not to my surprise, I'd never heard. I then opened the questions to the audience, because there were a lot that attended who had been employed by the health center, and they shared their stories. So I'm never surprised. Whenever I pick up the phone, this is after the publishing of the book, I always get a pen and a notepad, and I just take copious notes. And I have more stories than ever made this book. And there's so many stories that ended up on the cutting floor because I had a word limit. But I do want to make one observation of the event of several weeks ago. I was not surprised that I would learn new stories. What surprised me was the level of emotion at that event. People who knew my father expressed from their heart how they felt. He was revered. He was absolutely revered. And the average length of stay in terms of employment at the Samuel U. Rodgers Health Center was 25 years. And there was a woman who spoke at the event who'd worked there for 40 years. So when I say my father represented a lot of things to everybody, but the common thread was that they could see his commitment and they could see his compassion. And if I have to single out one thing that makes my father so special among so many, is his humanity. His humanity. And one of the panelists who started in the early 60s, he said to the audience, you know, you're not supposed to be here, meaning we are physically sitting in this building that nobody ever believed would manifest. He said of the medical community in Kansas City, there were one or two people who even thought it could happen. And he said the only reason that it did was because of one guy, and that was Dr. Rodgers, his compassion, his commitment to do the right thing. And so it was a common thread through all the stories and so many unforgettable memories. They were up against all odds. And a theme of this book is overcoming adversity, because my father had a lifetime, which is not uncommon in the Black community, of overcoming adversity.
Well, I think he was a shining example of, first of all, Black history. We're talking about this during Black History Month.
Yes.
And his example, they still have him out there, but they far and in between, because most of the people in all these professions seem like they're chasing money, and they're not doing, as Spike Lee, doing the right thing. So I want to close with this. As I said off camera, I want to work with you and your sister to develop something as it relates to people that did know your dad. And I would like to collect some of them stories on film, because when that hospital was, they were talking about the Samuel Rodgers Hospital, you talking about doubt. Not that I was paying a whole lot of attention. The next thing I know, this big facility was there. And as you said, I don't think politics or anything primarily, what I said about your dad, who he was, his personality, I think that overcame anything that was there. And that emotion that you talked about at the, what's the name? That was Mr. Rodgers. That was him. I'm like, hey, it was like, I don't care whether you notice me or this and that. I'm here to serve the community.
Yes, he was not, his goal was not fame nor fortune.
Yeah. So I think I still stole Jim Watts' closing by opening with it, but I'm gonna close with his and mine. And Watts always closes with, it was a plum pleasing pleasure to have you on the show. I'm like, Jim, cut out all the niceties. And
well, thank you, Carlos. The pleasure was mine. Thank you for the invitation.
And we always close. I would like to think wholeheartedly that your dad would approve of who I've become and what I do. And on our closing, when you invest in your community, you're really just investing in yourself. Good night.
Good night.
The program is brought to you by the Kansas City Business Association.